So let's start our lecture 15 on Gap Eul lecture in prayer. Visai, pray for us.
បាទគុណគ្រូអរថានទាំងអស់គ្នាអរព្រះវរបិតាដែលគុណបានជួបព្រះអង្គឲ្យអរព្រះគុណព្រះអង្គសម្រាប់ថ្ងៃនេះចាប់ផ្ដើមជាថ្មីនៅរៀនថ្មីជាមួយដុកទ័រ Robert O ព្រះអង្គជម្រាបសូមប្រទានពរដល់និស្សិតដើម្បីឲ្យនឹងមានប្រាជ្ញាចាំនឹងសិក្សាជាមួយនឹងដុកទ័របានយកអនុវត្តនៅក្នុងការបម្រើផងដែរគុណអរព្រះគុណសូមប្រទានប្រាជ្ញាចក្របញ្ញាញាណយើងខ្ញុំក្នុងការសិក្សានេះនៅក្នុងព្រះនាមព្រះម្ចាស់ព្រះយេស៊ូវគ្រីស្ទ
Amen. Thank you so much. I'm going to share the screen with you as always. Okay, Kakao Talk, Keynote. All right. As I told you, it's being recorded. Paksu. And while I'm sharing, if you could mute, everybody mute, so our recording will be better. So thank you for muting. As always, we're going to continue with our lecture using this book. And you start watching the video at YouTube. So I'm glad, and many of you already submitted your review paper, excellent papers, a lot of good questions. So I'm going to try to respond to those questions in my next lectures. You know, I really wish that we could do this in person, face to face, but because of the COVID-19, we have to do rest of our session through Zoom. So I'm really sad that we cannot meet face to face. I'm sure Visai is happy because he doesn't have to come from Siem Reap, but I'm not happy. So it will be same thing. Attendance is 10%. Your notes, lecture 1 through 14 will be 20% of your grade, and 10 pages paper on Gap Eul Research Proposal. That will be your 70%. And I'm going to explain to you more. And you'll be due in 3 weeks after our class is over. Our class will be over on March 31st. So I'm giving you 3 weeks. So, and then 10-page paper on Gap Eul Research Proposal. We'll talk about basically you have to write one or the other. You have to choose. Is it ID quality research or DT quantity research? ID stands for inductive, data-based, quality research. And the question that you have to ask is, does Gap Eul relationship exist in CPTI church plans? Okay, I'm not talking about Methodist, Baptist, I don't care. Does CPTI church plan of 160 plus churches, does Gap Eul exist? Or if you wanna do a data-driven, theory-based quantitative research, you have to ask, is Donggap church plan possible in Cambodia? Donggap means partnership. Can true partnership exist? And then you need to do quantitative research on that. So you choose one or the other. So while we're learning next 3 weeks, kind of think about that, and then you approach it from that angle. As I promised you, I'm going to do lecture 1 through 3, although you wrote an excellent review. Some of the reviews I'm reading, it's very, very good. Good questions. So I'm happy that you are actually watching and then asking me the right question. But I'm gonna briefly go over so that you could ask question again. And then I'm going to answer some of the questions already asked through your report. Lecture 1 was an introduction of a book that I gave you. And I'm so glad I gave you a hard copy. Because it was after the class, Professor Lifegiving approached me and said, since COVID-19 and all your meetings are canceled, can you teach us another course? I said, sure, you know, and I had to come up with 20 more lectures, but it was really a good challenge. So I did the introduction. I always start our lecture by stating that CPTI is not building or program, CPTI is people. And I really try to treat you, honor you as the fighter jet pilots not a commercial jet pilots. I really think you are the next level. So I'm counting on you. The future of Cambodian church plants. That's your job, not foreigners' job. And it's based on that 120 page, very, very short, because thesis was 300 pages. Now it's down to 120. And the key thing that I said, this book talks about, that's abstract, patron governs most relationship in global South cultures. However, regrettably, missionaries rarely recognize this distinctive cultural reality. Moreover, misunderstanding patron creates problem not only for missionaries, but also for national pastors, or in your case, Cambodian pastors. This book endeavors or tries to demonstrate when a patron plays a role as a father figure, he plays a significant role in developing national pastors as church planters and offers an alternative, different view of aid dependency, which is a chapter 3, which we're going to cover from today, as a relational concept rather than economic one. So this is an abstract brief summary. What is an abstract? Is a brief summary of research thesis or any in-depth analysis of particular subject. Is often used to help the reader quickly ascertain the paper's purpose. So abstract is, if you get this book like that, and when you write an abstract on the back, that just by reading this, you know what the whole book is about. So you must write an abstract for your master thesis as well. So when you're writing your master thesis abstract, less than 250 words, you have to explain what your thesis is about. So it'll be very important. The patrons govern global South cultures. And in my abstract, I wrote, patronage governs most relationship with global South. What is global South? You know, I realized that some of the words that I used, some of you do not understand because of, obviously, because you're not coming from an English culture, or that's an academic terminology, is academic words that you're not used to. So now I'm gonna try to explain. What is global South? Well, global South is a term often used to identify low-income countries on one side of the so-called global North-South divide, the other side being the countries of the global North. So every time in the academic field or scholarly journal talks about global South, it's talking about, in a way, the poor countries in the world. And unfortunately, Cambodia is considered one of the poor countries. So you know your country, you know where you are, right? It's global South. But among the global South, of course, the South Korea, right, and Japan, Taiwan is not considered global South, although regionally, locationally, they are in the South of versus North. But as you could tell right here, right? And China, here is what? Australia. And what are these three dots? What do you think those are? Of course, there's 2 dots, right? Those are Hong Kong, right? These are
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Singapore.
This is Taiwan. Singapore. The Singapore, Hong Kong, and where? Macau. Hong Kong and Macau. So basically, we're talking about the patron-client relationship dynamic exists in global South, okay? And the key thing that I'm focusing on is aid dependency. So the whole book talks about how to plan a church that does not have to be aid dependent. How can we plan a church in a cup and earl relationship, patron-client relationship, where we could have the same partnership, in Korean, 동갑. So how can we have 동갑 relationship? And I asked, how come I cannot do what I was able to do in Siberia? Siberia, we were able to plant 27 churches. They're all self-sustainable and they're multiplying. We support them for 2 years, $200 each every month for 2 years. And after 2 years, they all went on their way planting church. One church even planted 10 churches on their own. So I said, how come it works in Russia, but it's not working in Cambodia? That was my research question. And then we found out that 300 Cambodian pastors wanted to kick all the Korean missionaries out. So I said, how come? How come a lot of Cambodian pastors do not like Korean missionaries? Well, CPTI, you guys are exception. You are under Korean missionaries, so I hope you don't want Korean missionary to be kicked out. But at least 300 Cambodian pastors wanted to kick Korean missionaries out. I said, why? And probably it has something to do with 갑질 or patronizing, right? And so we'll examine Korean Gap Eul dynamics in church planting in Cambodia through CPTI students. So I'm not looking at from Methodist. I'm not looking at from Baptist. Because I am teaching at CPTI right now, I want to look at church plant through CPTI lens as a CPTI student. So I want to engage in research of church planting through CPTI student, not from the money perspective, not from aid dependency and money dependency and all that, but more from Gap Eul relationship. So I want to see from Gap Eul relationship, not from money relationship. So, but I'm most interested in what CPTI church plant has been doing so far, right? Aid dependency, not as a money-ish concept, but relation concept rather than economic one. So that's what I'm interested with this class. And I want you to engage in research or at least write a research proposal on that. After several months, however, talking about does Korean missionaries give rice to bring people in? Some of you already wrote saying that in your own observation that you also witnessed Korean missionaries giving rice. So it confirms. And in my own research, looking at the documentaries that Korean missionary has made, that they said, yes, we do give rice. Also, there was a report that Korean missionaries are giving money to members to bring them to church. And about this pastor in Kokong who had to quit after 14 years of ministry. And I was so burdened. I really weep, I cried because of that. That no missionary should stop someone's dream of ministering to Khmer people, especially if it's Cambodian pastors, especially if he worked at the field for more than 13 years. So who is Rice Christian? Well, Rice Christian is not new. McCormack constantly writes about Rice Christians in Cambodia. And we talked about how patron and client, and I noticed that Cambodian pastors talking about Korean missionaries, they use the term boss. And I showed you in the lecture how boss means to Asians. Boss means someone big, and in West, boss and we're kind of equal. But in Asia, especially in Cambodia, boss means someone so big that you cannot really have the same kind of partnership. But the fact that some Cambodian pastors think that Korean missionaries, they're boss, it's not very good. It doesn't look like you could actually then plan a Tonga church. And then of course, there was a problem with Korean missionaries church plants busing everybody from their villages. And the whole busing became a huge issue. And even busing problem, they also admit that they do bus people out. That was lecture 2. And then lecture 3, through Gap Eul relationship, I talked about patronage. What is patronage? Well, it's not new. It started all over the world because, well, it started in Europe, right? It started in Europe. And it's a patron-client relationship. What the people say patron-client, I am calling it Gap Eul, because patron-client, it's more of the European idea, European, the West, the white people society, it was something like that. But in Gap Eul relationship, it's where the farmers have a relationship with the landlord. The people who own a lot of land becomes patron or Gap or Eul, just like in Korea. In Korea also, it's a legal term. Legally, you call Gap. If you're a writer of a book, the publishing house becomes Eul. And I kind of explained to you. And Gap Eul relationship has to be equal. You know, the Gap has to give equal amount. The Eul has to give equal amount. There's give and take. It's never one-sided, right? If it's one-sided, it becomes patronizing. It becomes 갑질 right here. So we need to be aware of that. And now we talked about GDP, right? American GDP is 29 trillion, 20 trillion, and Cambodia GDP is 27 billion, right? And I share with you how big of the gap that is. And I'm gonna try to explain what that means. Why is GDP important for CPTI students? Mata Chef. And then someone still asked in the question, right? The big question that I asked was, through lecture 1 to 3, does patronage exist in mission? And of course I said yes, especially in Cambodia. It exists in Korea, exists in Cambodia, exists in USA. It's just, we call it different terms. Because patron, for example, I as a patron, and OS's house is what my wife has, and Cambodia Research and Resource Center is what I have. All my staff, you know, in a way, I'm their patron. I'm the one who's paying their salary. They're working. I'm the one who has to pay for the building, buy the building, run the facility. The OS staff, CRS staff gets paid. They're salarymen. I'm their boss. So the patron-client relationship exists. Now, patron-client relationship is a little different for CPTI students because, or even for me, because the Lifegiving ministry in USA is the one who also supports me. So I am actually first order broker, FOB. So I am also patron and also client, right? And I just make that clear. And the whole new concept from lecture 1 to 3 is that usually the patron-client relationship was understood only in terms of the boss, employee, one, you know, money, one with money and not. But I said no. But we have to look at from the role that patron plays as a cop, like a father. And the whole father issue, I asked, does father image look like this? And this is how West, the global North thinks about their father. And global South, Korea and Cambodia, look at father as this. So I asked, which father is appropriate image? And my argument is, well, we need both. We need both and. We cannot just talk about, oh, my father's image is this, and my father's image is this. You cannot do that. We need both. Mataho Chef, what do you think? And someone asked, if the relationship between father and son in Khmer culture, the son has to account father, relate to patron-client, power has to account to higher, okay? We know that is problem for ministering, therefore do we need to go forward to change the Khmer culture for Khmer church planters, not to submit to Korean missionaries, or what should we do? How do we solve the problem? Okay, that was a very good question. So I want you to ask questions like this in your report, because then I could engage, okay? So as you know that I asked that, now I'm gonna try to respond. So of course, when you are a young child, as you know, if Korean missionary is playing the role of a father, and you're a teenage boy, or if you are in your relationship, younger, right? And you don't have a job, your father brings home food, feeds you, clothes you, give you housing, and then you say, I want to do my own thing. Then you have a problem, right? You need to, in a way, have a proper relationship. If you are completely dependent on the Korean missionaries, then you really cannot be a partner. So my whole argument is work your way out. It may take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but work your way out so that you know that you could be independent. You could make a decision on your own. It's then and only then you could be a donga or partner. So even during the sponsor stage, that you need to earn the respect from your patron. So when your patron or your cop respects you and said, oh, you know, if I invest two more years, if I invest 5 more years, if I invest 10 more years, maybe that person will become mature enough to be able to do their own ministry, then by all means, you need to communicate. And at every level, the cop really has to also listen to the Ur. Because, for example, I have 3 children. And whether they are 2 years old, 5-year-old, 20-year-old, I have to respect their opinion. And so it works both ways. You need to talk to your patron and said, I understand, you know, you are completely, you know, supporting us. And so financially we're obligated and we cannot really run this ministry without you. But I think you need to talk to us at a level where you hear our opinion. So there's got to be a lot of dialogue. So not to submit to a missionary is not an option, but open communication, discussion, and really negotiation is what's really needed in that. Second question, so you really need to do, in order to answer that question, you need to do, is Donggap church plant possible in CPTI church plants? So why don't you go visit some of the CPTI church plants and ask, was there any kind of partnership between CPTI denomination, Presbyterian denomination, between you, and do a quantitative research and see if that's possible. So that would be a very good start. Another question was, why is it so important for Christian leaders in Cambodia in order to plan a self-sustainable church in future? For me, I don't know too. Why I need to know about GDP of the country? So that's a good question too. Because GDP is important because until certain GDP happens, the churches in the poor country, 90% or more cannot never become self-sustainable. And the reason that I'm saying this because according to my research, Korea is about, you know, so it's about 9th largest economy in the world. Even Korea, 70% of Korean churches cannot self-sustain. So when Korean missionaries ask Cambodian pastor to become self-sustainable, then instead of say, oh, okay, no, you say that, well, then can you wait for us until Cambodia becomes 9th largest economy in the world? So you as the next generation Cambodian pastors must learn how to defend or research so that you could present your case to the people, that you could let the missionary know and that you learn how to talk to the next generation missionary so that you know how to talk to them. So that's very important, okay? So that was Q&A. Is there any question answer at this point? I would like to entertain more questions. If you guys have questions, let me know. You could unmute yourself and talk. Okay, as usual, no questions. Okay. I'm gonna go. Okay, then we're gonna enter into chapter 3.
Yeah, Professor,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
want to a question
Yes.
about in Patron-Client in the lecture 4, we part-tie roles. Role as a father, sponsor, and partner. The client, the patron role as a father, it means protection. The patron role as a sponsor, it means provision. And patron roles as a partner, it means quality. So this all, I think that is useful. But what do you think about the best patron role as the father, sponsor, or partner?
Oh, so there is no best. It all depends on the circumstance, because when you start the church plan, beginning stage, it's best when patron plays the father role. But after 20 years, if patron still wants to play father role, then he's patronizing. He's doing 갑질 because he wants control. He's not very good patron. Good patron knows when to become a father, knows when to become a sponsor, knows when to become a partner. So if I'm planting a church with you, at the beginning stage, I will provide for you like a father. But at certain stage, I said, you know, you should really do this on your own. You should raise half of this church, you know, your salary on your own. And then eventually, I think you could do it on your own. And then I exit, I leave. So the boat leaves and the harbor remains. So that's what has to take place. So if the patron says, oh, I'll always be father to you, you know, it's like your own father telling you, oh, I'll always be father to you. I'll provide for you. I'll buy you car. I'll buy you house. I'll provide for your children's food. And then you never grow to be father yourself. Then your father is a terrible father because your father is not letting you mature as to become a man. Your father is spoiling you. If your father says, if my father said, I love you, so I'm gonna provide for you rest of your life. You don't have to go to school, you don't have to work. I'll provide for you, I'll buy you a house, I'll marry you, I'll provide for my grandchildren. Then said, stop. You're not being a very good father. Good father always learn to mature their children. Correct? So when I turned 19 years old, I told my parents, I don't want money from you. I'm gonna support myself all by myself. So I went and got a job, you know, cutting the grass and delivering the paper and manual labor from when I was 19. And I earned money and I bought my own car. I went to college on my own. I paid for my tuition. And because I want to become independent. So when I became a father, I had my own children. So when they turned 17, 18, I said, you're old enough. You should get a job. You should provide, you know. So the good father does not spoil their children. In the same kind of relation dynamic, if you're a good patron, father, then you're going to equip your follower to become independent and self-sustainable, self-providing, self-propagating. So that's what I mean by being the good father, being the good role.
Yes, one more question.
Yeah.
I heard from many Korean missionaries. They always said that Koreans do whatever by themselves, church building, something like that. So I heard from many Korean pastor, like Korean become sustainable by themselves. They don't want to get support from the other missionary, foreign missionary.
So I would like to ask you that, does Korean church plan situation have like a patron?
I didn't hear the last part. Repeat the question again.
Yeah, does Korean church planter have like a patron client? Do you understand?
So are you asking in Korea or in here?
Yeah, in Korea. Yeah, in Korea, because I heard many from Korean pastor say that the history of Korean, yeah, receive the gospel of Jesus from America, and they start building church and sponsored by themselves. Mm-hmm. So in Korea, does Patron-Client exist? Mm-hmm. Like USA and Korea, like USA is a patron, and Korean like a client. Does it exist in Korea?
Yes, it did. So I'll tell you a great example. Presbyterian denomination came to Korea, and Presbyterian missionaries plant churches, and they all left. So Presbyterian church in Korea, run by Korean pastors, and so they became independent right away. The Baptist missionaries from America came to Korea, and Baptist American missionary never left Korea. So still today, the Baptist denomination is the weakest denomination in Korea, because the American Baptist missionaries are still ruling the patron, and Korean pastors are still client. And the Baptist missionary never left Korea. So they still become the head. They're the top. And after 100 years, it becomes 갑질. So that's a good example of how Presbyterians start churches in Korea, and they all left Korea. So it forced Korean pastor to run their own and survive on their own. American Baptist missionaries still in Korea, still they are ruling party. They rule over Korean pastors. Not very good example. So yeah, does Patron-Client exist in Korea? Absolutely. And actually hold that thought, because I'm going to explain how that happened in this lecture, chapter 3. So thank you for that question.
Yeah.
So let me continue with chapter 3 then. In the chapter 3, so notice that I always put page number here. Page number 23 means the book that you're reading. This is a page number. So when you go page 23, that's what you're going to find. So in page 23, you'll find introduction 3.1, just like that. So this number represents your page number on this book, okay? And I'm gonna try to go very, very slow, okay? And because if I go fast, you don't understand, and there's no point to go fast. And also I'm recording this so that you could go back. If you don't understand that, you could go back and try to listen again. So chapter 3, finally, after 15 chapter, I'm gonna talk about the A dependency issue. So the introduction I write, while the patron-client relationship has been a popular concept in socio-anthropology studies, its values and effects have not been sufficiently explored within missional studies, specifically the resulting issue of aid dependency, and particularly between Korean missionaries and Cambodian church planters. So I talk about socio-anthropology. What is socio-anthropology, right? And I talk about aid dependency in the context of socio-anthropology. You know, I don't know if you understand what socio-anthropology is, so I'm gonna kind of try to explain that. And we're gonna talk about aid dependency Okay, aid dependent. It's not just money. It's not just like aid is not just money. It could also be resource, connection, job, and all that. So whatever that makes you dependent on, not just money, it could be relationship, it could be status, whatever, emotional even, is an essential theme in mission studies. And this theme has been sometimes explored to be used against national and transnational mission situation. Okay, what does that mean? It means that all of the missional studies, they blame nationals. For example, if they talk about mission in Cambodia, they tend to blame Cambodian pastors, saying that they are dependent. If you are learning about Indian mission work, and then the West, the global North blames, oh, these Indian pastors are dependent. If it's Bangladesh, Bangladesh missionary pastors are dependent. If it's Laos, Laos pastors are dependent. So they always blame the nationals instead of they blame themselves. Maybe what we do, something went wrong. How come when we do mission, how come we make all the national pastors dependent on our mission? Instead of asking the question, they go to a simple answer, which is like, oh, it's their fault. It's Cambodian pastor's fault. Oh, it's Indian pastor's fault. It's Bangladesh pastor's fault. Oh, it's Thailand pastor's fault. It's Vietnamese pastor's fault. How come they are so dependent on us? So that's what I'm saying, that sometimes that's not true. In other words, within missions and mission studies, there is a growing concern about dependency of those evangelized through mission agencies. Thus, it leads to important question, the sustainability and continuity of the mission work when the mission agencies and missionaries withdraw from their mission fields. That's good point. And some of you actually wrote here saying that I also worry, what if missionaries, Korean missionary leave? What if CPTI is asked to get out by the government next month? What's going to happen to our study? What's going to happen to our church plan? What's going to happen to my job? Okay, so these are the major questions that we need to think about, because there are a lot of things that are being written not in the religious circle, but in social studies. Like Sokhwan, he wrote a book called Aid Dependency in Cambodia. Sokhwan is a phenomenal scholar. You should read his books. And I think I donated that book at CPTI library, so you could check it out. He's a wonderful scholar, great writer. He actually went to same college as me, UC Berkeley, but he's Khmer. And his mother was a boat people, left 1975, and he's very critical of Cambodian government today. So he had a meeting in Phnom Penh, and he became very critical about Cambodian government. So he cannot come back to Cambodia. The Cambodia government would not let him in to Phnom Penh. So he's now just writing in America. Okay, so I'm talking about all the literature, aid literature. So including so far as books, I took following steps to review and clarify terms, aid dependency and patron-client relationship, and then identify their different usages in different countries and contexts. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that I read aid dependency in many books in aid literature, and came out with a working definition. So that's what you need to do. Also, if you're going to do a paper on your master thesis on aid dependency, then you cannot just say that, oh, Dr. Robert O said that aid dependency was this. You cannot just quote someone. If it's a master thesis, that's what Dr. Robert O said this, Year so far said this, so-and-so said this, but my definition of aid dependency is this. So you need to come up with your own working definition, okay? So I'm gonna answer what Darot was asking. So how is Korea become so independent? So aid dependency issue. This is Chester Crocker coined the term aid dependency 1968. Okay. It has since become the standard term. Let me read that. I think there's a 3.2. So 3.2. Oh, okay. So yeah, I transfer wrong. So I wrote, Chester Crocker coined the term aid dependency in 1968, period. It has since become a standard term in the development literature. Okay, so there's a guy named Chester Crocker in 1968 wrote in his thesis, aid dependency. And ever since that time, since 1968, when I was 7 years old, the whole world is using the term aid dependency. Okay, and then I told you about aid dependency issue, and it's not Cambodian specific. Now I'm gonna start picking up from here. Kim Sung-ho states that the success of Korean indigenous church plants was due to foreign missionaries' mission strategy of implementing John L. Nevis' three self principle: self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating. Okay, so that's what Darot asked. Darot asked, how come in Korean does patron-client exist? Yes, it did exist, but within the patron-client Gap Eul relationship, Korean Presbyterian churches, they learn to become self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating principle by John Nevius. Who is John Nevius? John Nevius was an American missionary, right? Who was a missionary to China. Okay, he was a missionary to Yantai, China. He's a graduate of Union College and Princeton Theological Seminary. So he's got really, really high education. Princeton Theological Seminary is a very good seminary in America. Even then, I had privilege of doing a 3-day lecture at Princeton. So it's a beautiful, beautiful school. So Nevius came from China to Korea, and then he started teaching Korean Presbyterian pastors how to become self-governing, self-supporting, and self-propagating churches. Okay? And then when I was looking this up, I realized that, wow, wait a minute. How come these churches I never seen in Cambodia? That right there is a cathedral in Cambodia. Have you seen that? Wow, wait a minute. And someone wrote, Sonia Rentilai wrote 10 top churches in Cambodia that will add more bliss and beauty to your trip. I said, wow, 10 top churches in Cambodia. First, St. John Catholic Church, East Riverside Road, Siem Reap. Have you been there? It's a Catholic church. Of course, we're Protestants, so you don't go to Catholic church, but still. And when people are visiting Cambodia, they said, St. John Catholic Church is beautiful. You should go visit in Siem Reap. Next time I'm at Siem Reap, I'm going to go visit. And then St. Joseph Catholic Church, another Catholic church at Phnom Penh. How many of you visited that? I don't even know where it is. But I'm going to go when COVID-19 is over. I would like to go visit. I didn't know that. Third, Battambang Catholic Church. It's all Catholic Church, right? In Battambang. Next time I'm at the Battambang, I want to go visit the church, then take picture. Ah, there's one called Light Church. It's evangelical church. Ah, at Sensok. It's near our house. Did you know there was a light evangelical church? That's interesting. Well, ICA I've been to, International Christian Assembly Church. That's the evangelical church at Sensok. New Hope Baptist Church in Phnom Penh. Have you been there? Of course not, because it's Baptist. You're Presbyterian. So, ICF at Siem Reap. Oh, okay. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Of course, we don't go because it's Mormons. But, of course, they are secular people. Church is church for them. Catholic church, Mormon church, they don't care. But they said it's a beautiful church. I don't think I'll visit there. Phnom Penh Church of Christ. Okay. At Turko, near my house. New Life Fellowship, of course. Right? So my question is, right? How many Protestant churches are there in Cambodia? Cambodia is a mixture of Catholic, Protestant church, right? There isn't a record number of Protestant churches in Cambodia. So do you agree with this or not? Why would you disagree? Because they have not mentioned a single CPTI church. It's mentioned. If CPTI planted 160 churches, how come nobody talks about CPTI churches? How come it's not one of the 10 beautiful churches in Cambodia? So what are CPTI church pastors doing that doesn't even get into the map? So when I type top Presbyterian churches, right? Because, okay, if they don't want to talk about, I want to talk about top Presbyterian churches in Cambodia. The first church was Korean church. The Light Presbyterian Church of Phnom Penh, right? I know the senior pastor there, Pastor Lee, Sung Min, right? But that's not CPTI church, is it? Well, what about top Presbyterian church in Cambodia? Well, all these churches, how many of it is CPTI church? Why is that important? It is important because if people talk about Cambodian churches in Cambodia, Korean pastors should not represent Cambodian churches. It's like if I research churches in Korea, okay? If I type churches in Korea in Korean, 한국 교회, and then push the button, and the first church plan is by American. Second church is by English. Third church by German. Fourth church by Japan. And no list goes on that talks about Korean church planted by Koreans. Then something went wrong with Korean church plants. Here, something went wrong because when I type top Presbyterian church in Cambodia, the first church plant represent Cambodia churches by Korean. Why should Korean represent Cambodia Presbyterian Church? That's my question. That should be the research question for you, right? How many CPTI church is self-governing, self-supporting, and self-propagating? Matao Chef, what do you think? You need to ask that question, right? So I think this will be a good time to have a little break because my voice is going. You know, doing through Zoom is much more difficult than person because I tend to shout because I want to make sure that you hear clearly. So is there any questions so far up to this point? Then I'll entertain a few questions and then go into our break, 10, 15-minute break. Any questions? No questions? Okay. Then come back in at 1:40 sharp. 1:40 sharp, come back. Take a bathroom break or whatever. Come back at 1:40 sharp using the same link to Zoom. Then you'll come in. Yeah. And if you have question in between, send me the question through Kata. All right? Okay, see you guys. You got it? Yeah.